Hello, everyone. For those of you who are in the Zoom right now, and for those of you who are following us on YouTube and Twitter, welcome to our book talk with Phil Gordon. Phil recently published the book, Losing the Long Game, The False Promise of Regime Change in the Middle East. And we will have a discussion about his book. And I will have some questions to him, and you can write your questions to Q&A box on Zoom if you are following on Zoom. And if you are following on Twitter and YouTube, you have to write your questions on the comment section. My assistants will collect those questions and send it to me in the meantime. Just a short introduction. I don't know if you need one, Phil. Phil Gordon is the Mary and David Bowles Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He served as Special Assistant to President Barack Obama and White House Coordinator for Middle East from 2013 to 2015, and Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs from 2009 to 2013. Of course, he has some other books, including Allies at War and Winning the Right War. And today we will talk about his most recent book. Phil, welcome. Congratulations for the book, and thank you for taking time. And I read your book, and it's an interesting pattern, actually. It was always there, but nobody put them together to bring that this is actually a pattern. And it's a pattern of US engagements in the Middle East, actually, military engagements for regime change. And there are familiar patterns, exaggerated threats, wishful thinking, failed military intervention, premature victory, and celebrations, of course, and often disastrous long-term consequences. But before we move on the Middle East, I want to, and the regime change attempts of the US over there, I want you to tell us a little bit about how you basically discovered this pattern, and tell us a little more about because the regime change attempts of the US was not only in Middle East. Before that, you mentioned in your book, Vietnam, for example, the Diem regime, right? And we, when we were students in Turkey, we all know about the Latin American cases, right? CIA-sponsored coup in Chile against Allende in 1973, and the role of Pinochet, we raised by watching some of the Costa Gavras movies, like Missing, and what it led to actually, especially human rights violations, repression of the opposition, etc. And Reagan administration attempt, of course, to overthrow Sandinista government in Nicaragua. So regime change attempts of the US is not something new, but it is not something old. When did it start, and how did it come to the Middle East? First, I want this, explain me the pattern and explain me the other examples around the world, and then we will move to the Middle East.
Great, Kılıç. First, thanks for having me. I look forward to this discussion. You've already raised a whole bunch of really big and important topics. I'll try to do my best. But I'm glad you used this word patterns in your opening statement, because that is what the book really demonstrates, is how in many ways similar these events are, even when in other ways they're very different. Because you could immediately say, you mentioned a couple of the cases I look at. It's a book about US regime change in the Middle East over the past 70 years. So it goes all the way back to the CIA-supported intervention and coup in Iran in '53. But then there are two cases in Afghanistan, supporting the Mujahideen in the 1980s against the Soviet-backed government, overthrowing the Taliban. Then obviously the Iraq War, 2003, which is the classic regime change. But then, quite interestingly, especially for me, given my role in the Obama administration, was efforts to do so more recently in Egypt, Libya, and Syria. Now, you could immediately say, pushing out Mubarak diplomatically in Egypt is very different from invading Iraq. So, how are these things similar? Well, they're similar in several ways. What they all have in common is that they were cases where the United States decided it was our policy to get rid of a regime and to replace it with something else for many different reasons, right? Sometimes this had to do with the Cold War. Sometimes it was weapons of mass destruction. Sometimes it was terrorism. Sometimes it was just saving lives. But whatever the reason, it was a case where the United States made it a policy to change the regime. And we also did it lots of different ways. I already mentioned, the CIA-sponsored coup, but other cases we support the opposition, like in Afghanistan. In Iraq, we invade and occupy the country. In Egypt, it was just diplomacy. In Libya, it was a NATO intervention. In Syria, it was support for the opposition. So those are all differences, but these patterns come up over and over again. And what you see in all of these cases is that once the United States decides to get rid of the regime, we tend to overstate the threat in order to build public support, underestimate the costs, and in every case, the costs were underestimated, sometimes vastly. And in every case, we produce unintended consequences where things happen afterwards that were not designed to happen. As you also noted, we tend to prematurely declare victory. That's the title of the book, Losing the Long Game, because in most of these cases, initially it looks like a success. And I talk about, as I go through these different examples, there's like a mission accomplished moment in most of these cases where we do get rid of the regime. We have a big celebration because we succeeded, quote unquote, but then we create a security vacuum and things start to go wrong. So what I discovered, to answer your question, is that there just seems to be this tendency over the decades, for a lot of different reasons, to believe that we can take our power and successfully change regimes in the Middle East, but frankly, the track record of doing so is very poor. Just very briefly on Middle East versus not Middle East, because you also asked about that. And yes, it's true. This is hardly a phenomenon exclusive to the Middle East. I focused on the Middle East mostly because that's where the current debate is. There's a debate about whether we should pursue regime change in Iran. We have tried to, and there's still a debate about whether we should pursue regime change in Syria. There are other people who have in mind, getting rid of and changing regimes elsewhere throughout the region. So that's what seemed to me it being most topical. I mean, this is a historical work, but it's meant to inform current policy, and I think it's most relevant to the Middle East. And I also think there are peculiarities or particularities about the Middle East that makes it even more challenging than elsewhere. In the course of the conversation, I'm happy to talk more about some of the other precedents, because every time there's a debate about intervening in the Middle East, people bring up these precedents, including the allegedly positive ones like World War II with Germany and Japan, or cases in Latin America. But the focus of this work has been primarily on Middle Eastern cases.
So thank you. And the first case you focus on is the Mossadegh, the coup, CIA-sponsored coup against the Mossadegh government in Iran. And as you mentioned in your book, it created the rise of anti-Americanism, which led to basically the taking of the hostages of Americans at the US Embassy after the revolution, and terrorist attacks by Iran and its proxies to US targets. And in planning of the coup, you have this quote, I just wanted to read it, it's on page 33. The plan, basically CIA and British intelligence plan, would consist in bribing journalists, editors, Islamic preachers, opinion leaders to undermine the government and fan the flames of distrust. Stories would be planted to show Mossadegh as a communist collaborator and as a fanatic, and thugs would be hired to organize protests and create chaos and instability on the streets. So this is, like for the people who read about Latin America, Africa, and Middle East, this sounds a very familiar pattern. Do you think this is also a pattern of US support of different coups in Middle East and in Africa, in Latin America, and the ones that maybe we don't know yet?
I do, and there's several things to say about that. One is, in fact, I call the chapter that you're referring to Original Sin, which maybe overstates it a little bit, but that's precisely the notion that I'm getting at, that this was an early case in the post-World War II period where we did it, and because it seemed like a success in the short term, it became the model for other interventions. In fact, again, you asked about other cases. It was only the following year in Guatemala that we did another coup to overthrow a government in the context of the Cold War. And one reason we did that was because it looked like this Iran coup was a model for how to go about pursuing your interests. It didn't cost very much. We got rid of this prickly nationalist. We kept Iran out of the Soviet camp, which was Eisenhower's reason for doing it. And so, you had the Dulles brothers, Secretary of State and CIA director in Washington, thinking, this is how to go about foreign policy. Remember, Eisenhower, even though he was a general, you might even say because he was a general, didn't think the United States should be in the business of, fighting wars in Asia. And he wanted to keep American budget deficit under control, defense spending under control. So he discovered, quote unquote, this other way of doing things where you didn't have to invade Iran to get rid of the government you didn't like. You could do it through these covert interventions. So then proceeded to do it again in Guatemala, and eventually developed plans to do it in Cuba, where, also in the context of the Cold War, there was a regime we didn't like. And the Bay of Pigs, of course, was launched under the Kennedy administration, but it was conceived under the Eisenhower administration. So the short answer is yes, this was in some ways a technique that the United States discovered at the time that it would then use later because of the apparent success. And I say, and this is the other thing I wanted to say in response to your question, I say apparent success because Iran 53 is a case where you really could say that in many ways it was a short-term success, or not even so short-term, because Iran stayed in the Western camp and the pro-American camp for 25 years before the unintended consequences really started to come out. And it was the years of repression under the Shah that led to this anti-American resentment, frankly led in part also to this Islamist extremist movement that manifested itself in the revolution and the taking of American hostages, and that now we've been living with for 40 years of hostility since then. Now, none of that was obviously guaranteed by the intervention itself, but it is fair to say that by intervening, we halted Iran's potential democratic process, and in some ways delegitimized the monarchy, which kept power, but not in a legitimate way, but through force, and then paid a long-term price for doing so.
Then your next case is about Afghanistan, and it's actually a long journey that starts in 1979 and it goes all the way actually today, right? It is, although there is an agreement between Taliban right now, we are not sure if it will be implemented. We don't see the outcomes yet. And when we see, when I read your Afghanistan case, and there were actually warnings, right? Prime Minister Bhutto warned about that this unconditional support may lead to disaster. Mm-hmm. And actually, at that time, the director of CIA, Robert Gates, said a lot of people actually that US is supporting were not the people you invite for dinner. And there's also another quote that you wouldn't let your daughter to marry with one of them. So right. Why United States kept supporting that? So it is not only the warning not only comes from Pakistan, but from the very higher echelons of the US government. Mm-hmm. What does go wrong? Where does the message doesn't reach to the very top that United States keep making that mistake?
Right, so this is definitely in the category of unintended consequences, and there are a lot of interesting things about the Afghanistan case. One is the slippery slope. When I talk about the differences in these cases, some of them are clear right from the start. The United States says policy is regime change and we're going to do it. That was in Iraq, right? 2003, Bush administration said, we're getting rid of Saddam. Afghanistan wasn't that. In fact, there's an even better comparison between the first Afghanistan and the second one. The first one against the Soviet-backed government in the 80s, it took many years to even settle on a policy of regime change, like from 1979 to the mid-80s, and then another half decade to achieve it. Whereas the second intervention in Afghanistan was a matter of weeks after 9/11 and the Taliban protecting the people who perpetrated 9/11. It took weeks to decide we're getting rid of the Taliban, and then a couple more weeks to actually do so. But the first one was a slippery slope in that even before the Reagan administration, the Carter administration began, as you noted, in 1979, to start supporting the opposition. Then, of course, the Soviets intervened. They invade on Christmas Day, 1979, and Carter pivots to a much tougher policy of providing assistance to the Afghan opposition. But the goal wasn't yet regime change. Carter had no notion that he could get rid of the Soviet-backed regime. We wanted to just make them pay a price. So it starts off as just, all right, the Soviets intervened. We don't like that. We're going to support the opposition to make them pay a price. Then Reagan comes in and says, no, they have to pay a big price. And not only have to pay a big price, we want to get rid of the Soviets. So then we start arming the opposition, along with Pakistan, and increase the cost on Moscow even more. And then, of course, it's not quick or easy. It's a few more years before we start providing Stinger missiles and other advanced military equipment to really up the pressure. And then finally, after a decade of this support, the Soviets decide to pull out. And there too, in terms of this mission accomplished moment, I tell the story you probably saw in the book that the CIA station chief in Pakistan sent a fax back to Washington that just said, "We won." Because there was this giddy feeling in Washington that by supporting the opposition, we succeeded. And then the Soviets leave, and then a few years after that, finally, the Afghan government itself collapses. So this is another one where you could tell the story in a very positive way. For a relatively small amount of money, the United States backed the opposition, overthrew the Soviet-backed communist regime, and had a big victory in the Cold War. But like all of these cases, you then have to play it out. And that's where this one is so interesting, in that, yes, we did undermine the Soviets and get rid of that government we didn't like, but we also contributed to a decade-long horrific civil war that killed about 1/10 of the Afghan population, drove millions into Pakistan. It was then followed by warlords competing over Kabul and fighting each other. That civil conflict only really ended when the Taliban came and took over Afghanistan. They then harbored Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda attacks the United States, and we do regime change again and put in a big force afterwards. And essentially 20 years and $1 trillion later, we're still there with the Taliban potentially forced to come back. So when you look at it in the broad scheme of things, that great success of the first Afghanistan intervention, you can ask some real questions about that too in the long run.
And there is another pattern, actually, before we skip to Iraq and other countries and US intervention. There is the marketing, the continuation of the war, especially emphasizing the progress by the administration, and how the media every time falls into this, right? We remember from the Pentagon papers that there was this attempt which was revealed later. And you mentioned December 2019 Washington Post revelations, especially about the reports, false reports about the progress actually in Afghanistan. And we probably would have a lot of them in regards to Iraq, right? Because there was multiple times George Bush, Dick Cheney, and other administration officials, Donald Rumsfeld, mentioned that there is an immense amount of progress, which may turn out to be in the coming years after different revelations that not true, actually. We can see it on the ground, but we didn't have the papers about that yet. Why the media and public opinion falls for this false hope each and every time?
Fascinating question, an important one. And you're right about the similarities, and you're right to bring up the Pentagon papers. The similarities between the Pentagon papers and the Afghanistan revelations of 2019 are striking. I would just maybe clarify one thing. We say, why does the media do this? The media is in some ways more the consumer than the producer of this narrative. It's the government itself that tends to overstate progress being made. And that's obviously the case in Vietnam, where generals would repeatedly make the case to the American public, and that's what the Pentagon papers revealed, that we were, they would do body counts and we were making progress on the ground and we've turned the corner, and the administrations would do that too. And it wasn't true. In fact, in the case of Vietnam, they knew it wasn't true and they peddled it anyway. But you see the same thing in Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly. In Iraq, the administration was always saying, yes, the first X amount of time was difficult, but now we've turned the corner. We are making good progress. These are dead enders. When they weren't dead enders, they were a massive insurgency, but even more in Afghanistan. And, I also tell that story in the book. You don't have to wait till the 2019 Washington Post revelations to know that there was this pattern where new commanders would come in and say, all right, it's true, we can acknowledge that the last year was difficult, but now we've got a new approach, making great progress. We've trained X number of Afghan police forces, X number of Afghan security forces, and now we're making progress. And if you were following Afghanistan closely, you knew that just wasn't the case. So you can ask why. And one explanation of it is just sort of a natural human thing. And as you noted, I was in the administration, an administration that was trying to make Afghanistan succeed. So I know and even sympathize with this. You want to believe you're making progress. When you've invested so much in something, you've made the case to the public that it was necessary to do. You've made the case to the public that their interests are at stake. And this gets back to this thing about selling. And, the moment once a government has decided to pursue the policy of regime change, you have to win support and sell it. So you persuade yourself, you persuade the public that this is a vital national interest. And it's almost, it's what the French would call déformation professionnelle. If your job is to succeed in keeping the peace in Afghanistan, then you're going to have that mindset. And it is understandable. If you're in the US military and you've been deployed to Afghanistan, you need that attitude, because how else are you going to succeed in your job? If you're an administration that is trying to build support and win in Afghanistan, you almost can't allow yourself to think that you're not making progress. But when you step back, as an analyst can do, and look over the long term, you discover that part of the pattern is just a relentless, excessively positive take on what is going on. And that's how you end up in situations where you're still there after 20 years, making the case that, we finally turned a corner, when in fact we're seeing the same pattern over and over again.
I was even after the announcement of this event, I started to receive some questions about the US regime change attempts in Middle East. And what is the question was, what is the role of Israel or other actors in the region in pushing United States for the regime change? And you mentioned in your book, Benjamin Netanyahu's, at that time, November 2002, expert witness actually in the Congress, saying that it will have a positive reverberations to overthrow the regime in Iraq. So do you think the other countries in the region would have some impact on the decision-making of the US when United States is making these decisions?
Sure, a lot of countries in the Middle East and in Europe, frankly, have played an important role one way or another, sometimes for and sometimes against. And yes, there are cases where Israel was for, and that's one. At the time, Netanyahu was just an opposition figure. He wasn't the Israeli government, because I think Israelis had mixed views on the Iraq invasion at the time, but a lot of them supported it, and Netanyahu was one. But I wouldn't overstate that variable, and I try in the Iraq chapter to be very careful in figuring out what the real motivations were. And guess what? There were a lot of different ones. You can't find a single variable or cause. I think more than anything, in the United States, it was the post 9/11 anxiety about weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. And one reason I think that's the most convincing explanation is that the same people who had opposed regime change in Iraq before 9/11 were suddenly big proponents of it. I mean, Bush himself was a sort of, he was a cautious president who said, we should be focused on things at home. Dick Cheney, before 9/11, in the first Gulf War, he was one of those most against going to Baghdad and doing regime change. But after 9/11, there was just this feeling, and Bush came to the view that we could never be safe if you have a regime out there that potentially had weapons of mass destruction and supported terrorism. And he bought into this notion that the real problem behind terrorism was the repressive nature of some of the regimes that were turning their publics into extremists. So he bought into this notion that if you could just get rid of that, democracy would spread throughout the region, and that would solve the terrorism problem. Now, I argue in the book that analytically that was just wrong. I mean, it was true that if somehow you could set up a peaceful liberal democracy in Iraq, that would be a positive incentive for Iraq's neighbors. But I think the administration then fell into the trap of just persuading itself that we were somehow capable of getting rid of this regime and putting a flourishing liberal democracy in place in Iraq, and that turned out to be a vast miscalculation. So there are a lot of variables, and so did Israel play a role in some of these things? I wouldn't overstate that variable. I underscore in other cases where it's other countries, like our intervention in Libya, where it's the Europeans who, maybe we'll come to that when we talk about Libya, the Europeans play a decisive role in persuading the United States to go in. Other Arab voices in that case were also critical in pushing the United States in that direction. So yes, in almost all of these cases, foreign governments and foreign interests play a role, but not necessarily a decisive role.
Okay, before we skip into Arab Spring, which you were part of the decision making, so we will have more in-depth question about Arab Spring, but I want to ask several questions about the decision making. So a lot of experts in Washington, D.C., it has been a commonplace. Experts like Elliot Cohen, former State Department officials like James Fallows wrote books criticizing militarization of US foreign policy and downgrading diplomacy, especially the role of the State Department. And my question is, do you think, is this a result of this short-term successes and immature declaration of victory of regime change, or is it the cause of it? Is it because that US foreign policy so militarized that we are thinking only about the intervention when it comes to foreign policy problems? Or is it as a result of these interventions that the role of the military increased in foreign policy as an instrument?
Well, I think you do have to distinguish among these cases, because the United States military isn't the main tool in all of them. It is in some, obviously, certainly the Iraq War. And one reason why US policy is more militarized than some other countries' policies is simply because we have the means. I mean, if you're a European country, it doesn't occur to you to advocate an invasion and occupation of Iraq. I mean, that was one of the differences between the United States and Europe in the run-up to the Iraq War. It's just the Europeans don't have the means, so it's not a policy option. Where the United States has tremendous military power, so it always is an option, and that leads some Americans to believe that we can use that power to accomplish things that to others seem impossible to accomplish. And that is what has led the United States down this road in the past, is this incredible optimism that we can put that tool to good use. One of the things that's interesting when you look at this period as a whole, though, is I think in many ways the Obama interventions, if you want to call them that, were a response to the over-militarization of the Bush approach and the invasion of Iraq, which Obama strongly opposed. But one of the things we learned there was that the alternatives to that can be complicated in their own way. So Obama thought he had come up with the anti-Iraq in some ways by doing Libya the way we did it, where the United States provided just unique military capabilities that only we had in the first phase, but then turned to Europeans to do the bulk of the air policing and airstrikes and security provisions afterwards. So we avoided in the Libyan case the over-militarization in the sense that we didn't invade the country and deploy massive forces in Iraq, but then we also discovered that there are consequences to not having such forces in the country afterwards as well. And that's one of my arguments there. People tend in these debates to always argue that the opposite of what we did was the right thing and that would have worked out. But the truth is, when you look at this series of cases, you see that there are costs and consequences of sending in massive military forces and staying, but there are also consequences and costs of not doing so. The lesson being, this is just really hard to do. And when you remove an authoritarian or any kind of regime and create a security vacuum, you are buying into a problem that militarily or not militarily, you might not have the answer to after you've created it.
Just to reiterate the role of the military, when I read that, is this a pattern? I will state some of my findings about your book. The role of General Shinseki in a critical moment in the invasion of Iraq, and his the testimony in the Congress, which angered Paul Wolfowitz and others at the White House, and General Mullen's intervention, I guess, in Red Line immediate after the Red Line speech, that it may be too costly. And it reminds me this Albright-Powell debate in 1990s. Yeah. Why are we keeping that the civilians are more willing to use military, whereas military was not willing to use its means as the first resort in these crises. And we see multiple instances of it, even in Vietnam War, some of the generals, the US ambassador actually, who was appointed in Saigon at that time, was, in his report, he was very reluctant to use force in Vietnam. Is this a pattern or is this just a coincidence?
I think there's an interesting pattern there, which is not the one that many people would think if they hadn't given it a lot of thought. People sort of reflexively think, you know, the Pentagon and the generals always want to intervene and use military power, and the diplomats just want to, you know, pursue diplomacy. When you look across this period of time, it's actually the opposite. The military tends to be more cautious, you know, arguably because they know what war is like and they know how difficult it is and know what the costs are. The military and the CIA, for that matter, have been more skeptical of regime change than, you know, civilians or other members of the national security establishment. So that's one thing about the bureaucratics of it that's a little bit counterintuitive. But the other thing about, you know, the Shinseki comment, which I think is important, is it shows this tendency of those civilians who do want to overrule the military and start making the case that we can do this without major military commitments. And that's where I think we get into trouble, and we do it. The pattern is, you know, pretty consistent over and over again, is underplaying what it's going to cost. And if there's one thing I discovered in looking at all of this history, is the tendency to believe you can do it on the cheap. Do it meaning get rid of a hostile regime on the cheap. Now, Iraq obviously wasn't the cheap, but even in Iraq, it ended up costed far more than proponents believed at the time. And if you remember the arguments at the time, we won't even have to put in significant peacekeeping forces. The neighbors will help us do it. Iraq can sustain itself because they have oil. Security won't be much of a problem. That was misleading. And, you know, when people like General Shinseki started to say, actually, we might need a couple 100,000 troops, as you say, they really angered the civilians. And when others suggested, if you remember another incident where economic advisors to President Bush started doing estimating the costs of the war, and they were also muzzled. In no case did we overstate the costs. In every case, we understated the cost. And the same thing is true militarily. There's this persistent tendency to think that a small amount of military force will do the trick. And I know you'll want to talk about Libya and Syria. But those are cases where advocates of regime change consistently suggested that just airstrikes or some limited intervention would succeed. And it turns out it always takes a lot more than that.
So moving to Arab Spring, you were in the administration, and there were several, the revolution in Tunisia, then Egypt, and then Libya. And when I read the book, was there a generational difference? And is that generational difference is a result of age, a result of experience, or a result of ideology? So we see, just to, for those who still didn't read the book, there is the principals and deputies, maybe the backbenchers, right? The principals, including people like Gates and then Panetta, Clinton, and Biden, actually, Vice President Biden, is more reluctant to jump off, to be on the right side of the history. And whereas the more junior members of the administration, maybe Ben Rhodes, Samantha Power, and others were more willing to engage, especially in these first three revolutions, the Egyptian, Libyan, and Tunisian revolutions. What do you say about that? Was there like that?
No, I do talk about that in the book and describe these generational divides, which you accurately described. I think they were most evident in the Egypt and Libya debates. Mm-hmm. Whereas you say on Egypt, so in Egypt, what was the question, right? You have this, you know, the revolution, people are rising up. And the question is to what degree should the United States support Mubarak, and to what degree should the United States push him out as part of this revolution? And it's true that in that case, the principals, the more senior advisors were more cautious. Everybody was for supporting a transition in Egypt, but the more senior advisors wanted to take it more slowly, pursue an orderly transition. And at this, you know, famous National Security Council meeting with the president, you know, mostly said, let's give Mubarak time. We'll support change, but who knows what would happen if Mubarak goes, and let's be cautious. And the so-called backbenchers around the table, the younger generation that you described, said, no, look, we should be on the right side of history. We should be supporting democracy, and helped tip the president's choice, where he ended up going in front of the cameras and saying that Mubarak needs to go, and there needs to be a transition, and we ended up pushing for an accelerated transition. So if your question is why, I think there are several things at play. In that particular case, I think it is partly the more senior advisors, or older, you could even say, have seen, were less confident that history was moving in a positive direction, let's say. For the next generation, there was greater hope and idealism that maybe we're finally seeing this change in the Arab world that we've wanted to see for a long time. And if we can just get rid of the government, democracy can survive and flourish in Egypt. Where I think the other advisors were more, let's say, cynical about that, or realistic about it. And also, don't forget, they had a different conception of Egypt, because they had been part of US policy for 30 years when Egypt was a close security partner. It had made peace with Israel. It was a counterterrorism partner. Mubarak was a loyal ally. I think you think differently if you've come to appreciate Egypt's role as a partner than if you're, maybe in the next generation and see the latter half of the Mubarak era, where he's repressive and non-democratic, and you really want to believe in this younger generation. So yes, there was definitely a generational divide on Egypt, and the same thing pretty much played out on Libya when it came time to decide whether we were going to intervene there. Same divide right in front of the president, with the more senior advisors, including the ones you mentioned, Gates and Biden, more skeptical about US intervening, and the younger advisors believing it was a critical thing for the United States to do to at least protect the people of Benghazi.
I have an interesting audience question, Phil, about Tunisia.
Yeah.
Among these three, they are saying that Tunisia was the most successful one, at least compared to Libya and Egypt.
Right.
Do you think it has something to do with the fact that US didn't intervene that much?
Right. Now, that's the obvious question, and it is really interesting. And I sort of flagged that in the book. I note that in the book without delving into it, because it's just something you can't help but notice, as I point out, that of all of the Arab Spring countries, the one that succeeded most was the one that the United States didn't pursue regime change and had very little to do with. And that's why I don't count it as regime change, just to be clear. For me, regime change is not just when there is a change of regime, as there was in Tunisia, but when it's a policy choice, that you're pursuing it and you do active things to bring it about. And we didn't do that in Tunisia. It happened, spontaneously. Now, there are other reasons. The reason I don't, go on much about it is there are other reasons to believe that, other reasons other than the fact that the United States didn't do it, that Tunisia might have succeeded. It's relatively small. You have an economic relationship with France. It's less caught up in these sectarian divides in the region that make it so hard in a place like Iraq to be stable after an intervention. Also, the fact that the Tunisians were able to observe what happened in Egypt. Tunisian, let's just say the Tunisian Islamist Party, saw what happened to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt if they pushed their agenda too far, and understood that maybe you need some reconciliation rather than prevailing over the other side. So I wouldn't overstate the point that Tunisia succeeded because the United States had nothing to do with it, as if everywhere else would succeed if the United States had nothing to do with it. I wouldn't overstate it, but it is kind of a neat thing to notice, and it does at least make you think twice about the notion that the United States is the solution to these problems rather than the cause of some of them.
Among the questions that I received, there were several on Syria. And probably this is something I think that will haunt President Obama for a long time. Because even in his last interviews as a president, I still see he's uncomfortable about answering questions about Syria. You can see his frustration, at least his body language, that there was so many questions about this. What went wrong in Syria? So the questions, there's a chapter about Syria actually in the book. And is it, the questions were mostly about, then why not regime change attempt in Syria? Do you think there was an attempt to change the regime in Syria, and it's kind of, like they created those patterns of failure? Or was United States trying to follow a different set of foreign policy priorities when it came to Syria?
Yes, and first let me say, Syria haunts all of us who were involved with it. It can only be haunting when you look back at this just terrible period of killing and repression and refugees and devastation. Nobody can be anything other than haunted by the outcome in Syria. And that raises important policy questions about, what were the alternatives? Did we do the right thing? Should we have done more? Should we have done less? So that's why this is so important. And as you say, I write about it and try to tell the story and draw from these lessons. And yes, I do think, so Syria is the one case that I look at in the book where we didn't succeed in getting rid of the regime. All of the other cases, the regime left and a different one was put in place. And you can debate how successful it was after that, but we got rid of the regime. In Syria, I describe as a case of attempted regime change, because we did things to try to bring about the removal of that government and putting a different one in place, but it didn't succeed. And to me, the lesson is, I made the point earlier about we always underestimate what it's going to take to do this, especially when it comes to military force. In that case especially, it would have taken a lot more military force to get rid of that regime. And just this recipe of giving support to the opposition, putting on sanctions and supporting the opposition to try to bring about regime change, I think you can only say, if you're really being self-reflective about it, ended up escalating and perpetuating the conflict, but not ending it. And that's where, I think just honest looking back is really important. A lot of people look back and say, well, the lesson of Syria is you should have done more of that. And again, you can only respect that view because certainly what we did didn't work, and a decade of war and killing and refugees in Syria and extremism didn't benefit anybody. But I caution against the notion, and I really push back hard against this, that there was some quick fix, that if only we had provided more weapons earlier to the opposition or done some airstrikes, all of this would have gone better. In many ways, this is the opposite side of the Iraq case, where in Iraq we did intervene militarily, and obviously we did get rid of Saddam Hussein, but then we were stuck with this situation where no one knew how to fill the security vacuum that we had created by doing so. And I am not persuaded that there was some moment where a little bit of military force or a little bit of arming the opposition would have brought about transformation and a new regime in Syria without raising that same question of what happens once you do get rid of the regime.
There is a code word, Phil, red line. And in the Middle East, it almost become a symbol of uncertainty in US foreign policy, unpredictability, indecisiveness. And all of the good part of, today is everybody is writing their memoirs immediately after leaving the administration. So when I read Samantha Power, Susan Rice, Ben Rhodes, even David Rothkopf tells a more or less similar account of what went on in the red line and its aftermath, especially after the use of chemical weapons in Ghouta a year after the red line statement, and how President Obama basically decided not to do that. What is your account of what happened about the red line? Do you think it was a wrong judgment on the part of President Obama, or do you think it was what it needs to be done at that point?
I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the red line incident, and I was at the White House at the time and lived through that entire episode. What I mean by misunderstanding is there seems to be a view out there that if Obama had only carried out these planned airstrikes in September 2013, the course of the war in Syria could have been changed and all of these lives could have been saved and the regime could have been removed. I think that vastly overstates what would have happened if the United States had carried out the airstrikes. Now, to be clear, and I'm clear in the book and other things I have written, I supported carrying out those airstrikes at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I think, you can debate whether Obama should have issued the red line in the first place, which he did the previous year when he said, if we see them, moving a bunch of chemical weapons around or using them, that would change his calculus. Having made it clear that that was US policy, I think it was important to back that up and show that there would have been a price for crossing that red line. But that would have been about deterring chemical weapons use and degrading the regime's ability to use chemical weapons. It really wouldn't have changed the course of the war. Even pretty significant airstrikes to do that. I think the reason Obama decided not to do that is he feared just that. We would do the airstrikes. You'd have a short moment and people would applaud and show we were tough. But then the war would go on. They might wait and use chemical weapons again later and we'd have to repeat it. And I think President Obama was particularly concerned about the lack of public and congressional support for using military force. And that's why, to be precise, and I think this is also misunderstood, Obama actually didn't decide not to strike. If you go back and look at the decision he made, and he announced the next day in the Rose Garden, he announced that he was going to Congress to get authorization to use military force. He actually says, again, read the Rose Garden speech, which was just the day after deciding not to proceed that weekend with airstrikes. He says to the public, I've made two decisions. One is we should conduct military strikes on Syria over chemical weapons, and even makes a pretty impassioned case for how could we look our children and grandchildren in the eye if we don't respond when they kill civilians with chemical weapons in Syria. But then he said, two, I'm asking Congress to authorize this because I don't want to do this without public and congressional support. So that was the decision, and what we found immediately afterwards is that there was no congressional support, and Congress didn't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole, and that's what put us in this awkward position of the president calling for the use of force but not being in a position to execute it. And then of course we got the deal to get rid of the chemical weapons anyway. But my point about it, and this is the essential point, is carrying out those airstrikes might well have deterred Assad from using them again. And one thing, this is an experiment that we don't have to speculate about in some ways, because the Trump administration did carry out airstrikes over chemical weapons in 2017 and 2018. And I think you could argue largely deterred the regime from using them again, even though they used chlorine and other chemical weapons. But it didn't change the course of the war, and it didn't mean a bigger intervention, and it didn't mean regime change. And that's the essential point. Even if Obama had done those strikes in 2013, Assad might not have used chemical weapons, but he would have continued to prosecute the war. And then we would have seen the same dynamic that we saw all along, which was escalation by the United States and its partners behind the opposition, led to escalation by the regime and the Russians and the Iranians, and forced the United States, if it really wanted to do regime change, to intervene much more directly and massively.
And what do you expect, would President Obama expect that the Congress would approve such a move after the Benghazi incident in 2012?
There was a debate about whether we could succeed in getting that authorization. And to be honest, there was skepticism. But I think what President Obama wanted to do was put that ball in Congress's court. If they weren't willing to do it after Benghazi and all that, okay, fine, then we're just not going to do it. But if you remember, there were a lot of members of Congress demanding greater action by the United States, take a tough line, criticizing Obama for not being strong enough or willing to use force. So I think what he didn't want to do, and he's a constitutional law professor and a former critic of presidents who abused their authorities. Mm-hmm. And so he was not comfortable being such a president, saying, look, the public is against this, Congress is against it, but I'm just going to take my presidential authority. And he was briefed. I described the story in the Situation Room where he, unlike the current administration, Obama ran a very careful national security decision-making process and went around the room and pulsed his top advisors on the intelligence, on the military preparation, on the diplomacy, and also the legal advisor, who briefed him that he had the constitutional authority to use force without congressional authorization, though it would be more prudential and helpful to have it. Obama was always uncomfortable with that. And so he decided, we'll try to get congressional support. And believe me, we did. I mean, and Vice President Biden was deeply engaged in this, and Secretary Kerry and National Security Advisor Rice and others trying to persuade Congress. And what we just found back, and this is a lesson about the American public's willingness to do what it takes to change these regimes, members of Congress were like, no way. We're getting calls, 90% of calls telling us we want nothing to do with that. So still a bit of spillover from Iraq, which is another problem for those who say that the lesson in Syria is, we should have been willing to do more. There just wasn't public appetite for that. And same with Libya, for all the debate about whether we should have put in more peacekeepers afterwards. You're right to mention Benghazi. We struggled to get approval for one civilian in Tripoli because of the security situation after Benghazi. So the idea that you could generate public support for significant peacekeepers or real military intervention in these countries, I think just misreads what the public was willing to do.
It sounds like, especially in the decision room, there was this cherry picking of historical analogies. So it would be a Vietnam, it would be an Afghanistan, if there would be an intervention. And those who support the intervention would argue that it would be a Rwanda, right? It would be something totally bad, out of control, that we had to intervene at that moment. But you mentioned multiple times Congress, and among all of the patterns that you mentioned, I discovered a pattern of congressional activism when it comes to regime change, especially in Afghanistan through Charlie Wilson's attempt, in Iraq in 1998, Iraq Liberation Act, and in the aftermath, even in Libya, there was this congressional activism. And you sound like you have disapproval. The book has disapproval about this increasing congressional activism when it comes to regime change, together with political elites. Because I look at that, and you mentioned the Congress, and you mentioned the political elites in Washington, D.C. that supports the intervention one after another. Do you think this is another pattern and it will continue? And nowadays, of course, we are seeing an increasing activism in foreign policy, especially in the Congress. And do you think it is something right for the US foreign policy, for its long-term interest?
It's a fascinating question on the role of Congress in these debates. You're right to notice the pattern. And in many of these cases, Congress played a very big role. And there's always tension between the executive branch and Congress on this. And I particularly describe that role. I mean, you're right to mention Charlie Wilson in Afghanistan, although, of course, the administration then was pretty enthusiastic too. I particularly emphasize it when it comes to Libya, because that was a case where Obama, his instincts were certainly not to intervene. His whole, he was elected president against intervention in the Middle East and, spreading democracy. And I don't think that was where I know that's not where his instincts were, but I describe seeing on CNN some members of Congress start to make the case for action. And that's when I started to realize we're not going to be able to stop this. There's going to be media pressure and congressional pressure to act. And, that's partly in the nature of things. Members of Congress, it would be typical of the executive branch to say what's easy for them to say, because then they don't, they're not responsible for what happens afterwards. But that does put the pressure on the administration to act. I think in Syria, the same thing is true. Obama's instincts were not to intervene, but it's difficult to even, testify before Congress and not have answers to these questions. And you get this pressure, what is the United States doing about it? Which is, again, a very American thing, because we have the means, we're seen as having the responsibility to act. But again, that's why it's one of the main reasons why Obama insisted on authorization legislation for the chemical weapons airstrikes, because he pictured just that. Congress clamoring for action, denouncing his inaction, pressuring the administration to do something, and then doing it, and then finding out later that that support disappears when something goes wrong, as it inevitably does when you intervene militarily. So that's why I think his attitude was, if you guys are going to clamor for action, press me to act, fine, authorize it, and we'll go ahead. That becomes much more difficult. And you see now how, most of these interventions now are still taking place under the authorization of the military force from 2001, because Congress is not willing to take responsibility and authorize a specific new intervention. And that's a real problem with the system. We're still intervening. That authorization, was about Al-Qaeda and affiliated groups, which is just very different from what we're dealing with now. But Congress, despite pressure from the administration, hasn't been willing to authorize a new one.
And another question from our viewers in Turkey, about the Syria, of course. It is something that, especially after the refugee flow, export of insecurity, Turkey was basically had a lot of issues about Syria and US decisions in Syria, especially the YPG issue. And do you see any similarity about supporting the bad guys for the short-term US interest, and which could lead to some disastrous consequences later when you think about the US support for YPG?
Let's just say from the start that none of us succeeded in Syria, and that applies to Turkey and the United States. And obviously Turkey played a major role here, and we were closely involved with the Turks from beginning to end. And just as I described US policy not being always entirely consistent, neither was Turkish. Turkey, if you remember, initially was reluctant to move in the direction of regime change in Syria. And I remember dealing with our Turkish colleagues who wanted more time to try to help persuade Assad to reform, because Turkey had invested a lot in Syria and had important ties there. So Turkey actually, I think, came around to regime change in Syria after the United States did, but then became an even more enthusiastic proponent of it, and consistently tried to push the United States to do more to finally get rid of the Assad regime. As to the question of supporting the YPG and the consequences of that, and it is another thing that has long-term and unintended consequences. There was an important US-Turkish piece behind that too, which was that Turkey constantly said it had an alternative to the YPG, Free Syrian Army, other opposition forces, to fight both the regime, this Syrian regime, and the Islamic State, but never was really able to deliver that entity, that military force, to do so. And so I think it was only out of expediency and desperation and the lack of alternatives that the United States turned to the YPG as a partner to deal with ISIS, because it was the wolf at the door. But like all of these things, there are consequences of doing that, and that has undermined US relations with Turkey and created other problems within Syria.
Yeah, it is among the questions that they refer to my quote, one question that would he invite YPG members to dinner. So it is the same. You can understand the reaction in Turkey and long-term consequences, especially when this US support took place, when the PKK launched its attacks to Turkey, especially the civilian targets.
I mean, it is related to that, and it's a fair comment about wishful thinking and euphemisms. Those quotes that you pull out, were interesting. That's Robert Gates, and then I think Milt Bearden, who was at the CIA, talking about our support for the Mujahideen in euphemistic terms, as you quote. That's not who you'd want your daughter to marry. It's not who you would bring home for dinner. It's a euphemism, because what they really mean is these were warlords and extremists, and it shows you make those compromises. And to me, the only lesson of that is understand what you're doing. If you're going to be supporting armed groups on the ground, don't pretend to others or yourself that these might be moderate democratic partners. If they're armed groups as part of an insurgency, then that's what they are, and there are consequences that come along with doing so.
Phil, I know that our time is up, but there are a couple questions that I want to raise in the next 4 or 5 minutes. Apologies for that. The first one is US policy in Iran and Venezuela. So you mentioned all of those lessons, right? That it kind of keep failing, but US is still trying in Iran, right? A little bit. It is not obvious, but the maximum pressure, the end result seems that, not President Trump, but some in the administration would be happy to have a regime change in Iran, and more openly Venezuela. We don't know what's happening with President Trump and the recent revelations about the meeting in Mexico, but we see that there was an immense pressure to Maduro government, to change the regime, recognizing the opposition as the legitimate government. How would you explain that after all these failures, why United States is trying again?
So I'm glad you bring this up even as we reach the end, because it's a really important part of it. And it's the part that links the history to the present. Because in some ways, that's why I wrote the book, is watching the Trump administration go down this path now, whether it's Iraq or Venezuela or Syria, Iran or Venezuela or Syria, but particularly Iran. It occurred to me that before we do that, pursue regime change in Iran, maybe we should learn the lessons of previous cases, even if they're very different, and understand these patterns where once the administration sets down that course, it tends to overstate the threat and underestimate the costs and unintended consequences. And I do think there are a lot of important lessons for these two cases, the most important of which include how hard it is to do. That don't imagine that just putting sanctions on the country or even providing modest amounts of military force to the opposition gets rid of the regime. History shows us that the opposite is the case. Look at, I mentioned Cuba Bay of Pigs, but we've been trying to get rid of that regime ever since. And we've had sanctions on Cuba ever since. And Cuba is a lot smaller and poorer than Iran, and yet the regime is still there. North Korea has been isolated, sanctions. The regime is still there, and it also, has acquired nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. So it really is fanciful and unlikely to imagine that if we just put a little bit more pressure on Iran, that somehow the regime will collapse and a better regime will come into power. It just doesn't work that way. And Venezuela is also interesting too, because Venezuela, you would have thought, had like better conditions for regime change, because you had the whole world saying the regime is illegitimate, put on multilateral sanctions. But even in that case, in some ways, it has strengthened the regime rather than weakened it. So everything I write about is a cautionary tale about what we think we can accomplish in these countries now. Sometimes, you have to live with a situation and manage it and contain it, rather than thinking you can make it better with all of the costs and unintended consequences. And that's what I worry about in Iran, because let's say the sanctions and maximum pressure don't work to bring about, so they create misery for the Iranian population. They push Iran out of the nuclear deal and lead it to start expanding its nuclear program again. It acts more aggressively in the region. So the sanctions didn't work. So then you take the next step of start supporting opposition. And then do you take the next step of providing material support? And before you do that, it's probably useful to look back at these lessons and how they ended up before going down that road again.
Two questions, the last two questions, I promise. One is the next administrations, whoever is basically will come, with a victory after probably next week, the week after next week. So would you expect any difference between two different individuals, candidates' foreign policy in regards to regime change? So we know at least what President Trump is willing to do, but how about the Biden?
Look, there are obviously enormous differences between the two in temperament and style and on policies as well. There's one thing, arguably, that is about the United States now rather than any particular candidate, which is a lack of appetite for military interventions. I mean, you hear the debate about ending forever wars or endless wars is a bipartisan debate. In fact, you hear it from President Trump, but Vice President Biden also says no more endless wars. So that's a quite American thing. Americans, are fed up with the costs of Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't think are enthusiastic about military intervention or regime change. That said, at least on Iran, the two have very different policies that I would argue at least makes regime change a greater possibility under President Trump than Vice President Biden, simply because it's the logic of his policy. He doesn't want the nuclear deal. He's increasing maximum pressure on Iran. And he doesn't really seem to have an answer other than, well, we'll just keep the pressure on until the regime goes away. Whereas Vice President Biden, president, is also concerned about Iran and its role in the neighborhood and its nuclear program, but has a plan of containing the nuclear program with a nuclear deal and using diplomacy. So neither one is eager in its pursuit of regime change. But I think the risk of going down that road is far greater with President Trump than it is with Vice President Biden.
The last question is again about Turkey. After talking about Musaddiq, some viewers from Turkey is asking what could be the US role in the coups and coup attempts in Turkey. And if you know, because there is this, like the interview with the putschist in 1980, Kenan Evren, who said when he met with the Secretary of State for the first time, he said, "Why were you so late?" A statement like that. And after—
Sorry, what was that a reference to?
Why he asked the leader of the putschist why the military was so late intervening. And there were, especially after the July 15 coup attempt, there was a lot of debate about the potential US role. And it is not only the US role, it is the presence of basically the person who Turkey holds responsible for the coup attempt is in United States. And especially for many in Turkey, one of the things that bothered them most was the not using the C word, the coup word, in the first two statements that came from first Secretary of State, then from the White House. So what is your, basically you were at the White House. I know that you were in touch with your colleagues from Turkey at that night. So what happened? Why the second statement, of course, didn't have a C statement, like the stating that it was a coup attempt?
Right. So I had left the White House. I don't know if you said I was at the White House. I was no longer there when this happened. I was out of government, so I can't speak for the debate that took place within government. I do know that always in these situations, there's a lot of uncertainty. The fog of war, getting conflicting information. So sometimes governments are slow to define or attribute things. I don't know how long it took them to say it was a coup, but it didn't take that long. I think the consensus in the US government and among analysts is that there was a coup attempt. But in the fog of war, as conflicting things are coming in, I do know that it's a habit to be careful and figure out what actually is happening before you say anything about it. And I also know, and this would be the subject of an entire other hour-long discussion, that I don't think the US government has seen any evidence that the person that you're referring to was involved in the coup and therefore should be held accountable for it in some judicial manner, which I know is the whole debate about extradition and all of that.
So probably, now there will be a lot of questions that is, Turkey sent the necessary evidences about this, and probably we need to talk about this more. So I try to be in this, at least in this book, in this panel, I try to be loyal and talk about the book. And there are so many questions coming about the US foreign policy. I try not to ask those, and I apologize for those viewers who ask those questions. And hopefully we will have you again, Phil. And one more time, congratulations for the book. And hopefully we will see you again.
Thank you so much, Kılıç. I really enjoyed the opportunity to talk about it. And thanks to everybody for joining. It was really interesting.
Thank you.